He did not smell of oil like us, but of fat. The fact that my father had engaged him had to do with his talent. From tiny impressions in the ground and almost invisible scraps of fleece caught in thorn bushes, he could tell which way the animals we were following had gone. He taught us how to half-look. As long as you were just looking, all you saw was the little dimples the rain had made in the sand. By half-looking out of the corner of your eye, quickly turning your eyeball away, or by squinting through your eyelashes, you could see a line in the landscape, the track you had lost. He had his son with him, a young child not half my age, named Put. The child was as dark as I am, so even the Radhika we met thought he was one of us. He was an intent child. His father wanted him to look at the ground and at the horizon, drawing his attention to the small creases in the landscape that indicated the presence of rocks or water. But these were not the things the child had an eye for. His attention focused on us. He was always the first to notice an ulcer growing under someone's nail, or the sun scorching particular parts of our skin. Then he would call out, "Father, I'm tired as a dog," but he himself kept ceaselessly running back and forth, even long after we had sat down, sometimes even after we had fallen asleep. Behind Alim came the donkey. It was young and very willing during the day, but at night it was so beset by whips and prods in its dreams that it brayed constantly and kept us awake. Its shoulders were covered with blankets to prevent chafing. It pulled the reed sled on which my mother lay. The sled was supported on the donkey's flanks with a bracket. The other end was flat and dragged along the ground. If anyone wanted to follow us, all they had to do was look for the deep furrow left on the hills by the weight of my mother's body. She was wrapped in the same dried, grass-filled blankets as the donkey, not that it was much help. After only a few days, her back was blue from the bumps and the rubbing, and the back of her head was practically bald. We stopped more often to change her position than to drink. Then there was me, Re Jana. I had nearly reached the end of my growing years. The rate at which my arms and legs were getting longer was slowing down. I was nearly as tall as my father, and for my yoke I could use the ropes he had made to fit himself. I carried the jars of oils and scents. If I stumbled, they all knocked together, and I sounded like a boisterous little band. Close to my body, up against my shoulders, I carried my store of water. To get used to living on land, I drank gourds full. Alim insisted that would help. Just like dry bread stops you feeling sick on a boat, fluid in your stomach was supposed to protect you against the anxiety and oppressiveness of being on land. I accepted every word out of Alim's mouth as the truth. He was a wanderer. He had seen the world. I had never quite been able to hide my fascination with his people, with their swarms of children, with the way they shook the clothes they had slept in of a morning, like waiting birds shaking their feathers, and with the way they would, from one moment to the next, string all their belongings together and throw them onto their animals' backs, hoist their children onto their hips, and disappear. They could go without food for days on end. Even as children they learned to get used to the feeling of gnawing hunger. Privation was a mere inconvenience. Last came my father. He assumed that erotica could only rarely be right, and paid the price for it. He refused to drink unheated drinks, and often the only thing he would take in before nightfall would be the sun-warmed drops from blackberry flowers. And so the land made him sick. He plowed up the ground with his stick as if it was an oar rather than a support. He was not used to walking far. In all of his life he had rarely covered any distance greater than a few times the length of his fishing boat. He had great strength in his arms, but hardly any in his legs, yet he never stumbled. His attention to the unevenness of the path never slackened. His balance was important, because he carried the silkworm cage, which had been specially designed for the journey. The small mulberry bush had its roots in water, so the silkworms were constantly threatened with death by drowning. And he carried the brazier, that glowing escape from hunger and cold. But above all, he was fulfilling my mother's dream. He was taking her away from the water. He was making good his promise to go and live in the stony desert, to find other work and another place to live, away from the marshes with their nerve-wracking tides. For weeks on end we walked. We left the landscape we knew. We crossed riverbeds, filled our water bags, and made our way into a dry region full of limestone rocks that showed through the thin layer of earth. We passed pastures full of sharp grasses, crooked acacia trees, fig trees without fruit, and spent the night under tamarisk trees with ragged bark and leaves soft as down. For every day that passed, my father made a knot in his belt. In the end, the belt became so short it would no longer fit around his thin waist. His face was gray. The emptiness, the boulders, the absence of reeds and mosquitoes made him wretched. Every evening he washed my mother with the water he had saved up. He heated it to the same temperature as her skin. He only allowed himself enough to keep going. All through the journey to the shipbuilders, we begged him to drink. Only after we had passed the cliff from behind which hammer blows could be heard, and could see the gigantic ship we had been told about, did he, without saying a word, grasp the water bag by my shoulder and drink greedily like a small child, until the bag was empty, and so limp that it blocked his view of the shipyard. The wandering Radhika had not lied. Past the crumbly ridges, in a place where you would expect nothing, or at most a small settlement, a shipyard had been built, which spread like a lake. Apart from a pond, surrounded by scrub, where people came and went constantly, the place was as dry as dust and strewn with rocks. The first thing that greeted you was the smell of pitch, then the sounds. The air was full of the sounds of hammering and planing, and the rattling and grinding of drills reached you right over the top of the ridge. Then, once you had reached the top, you suddenly had a view of something like a city being built. In an area with so few forests, the sight of so many stacks of timber was overwhelming. Wood shavings whirled like mere dust in the wind. In every conceivable spot stood the tents, stone houses, and barracks of the countless workers who were running around, busy as ants. Most conspicuous was the tent on the slope of the hill where all paths seemed to lead. It was red, as if drenched in ox-blood. The tent's opening faced the valley. It looked straight at the heart of the shipyard, at the spot that made our mouths go dry as powder. Over a wide excavation in the hard ground stood a gigantic scaffold, with a boat-shaped structure trapped in a web of vertical and horizontal girders. This was what people in the marshes had been laughing about, the ship in the stony desert. It did not yet reach very high, still showing only its ground plan. Its future scale was visible, but the design revealed the lack of confidence of the builders. Yet the stores of timber and pitch all around revealed its maker's ambition. That was the first thing we, as people looking for work, sensed, that the project down there was being carried along by something powerful, that it had gone far beyond being just a dream. Quite possibly, that was what made my father reach so thirstily for the water bag. 1. The Descent. The sun stood at an angle behind us. We could make out the small fires more easily than the women who were doing their cooking on them. We put down our burdens, my father, the cage and the brazier, Put, the case with the ornaments and the shells, I, the yoke, and Alam, the hides that made up the tent. I sat down from sheer exhaustion. More than anything, the wind had tired me, that perpetual tugging at your hair, the dust in your face, the whistling in your ears. Keeping low down to the ground was a help. Then it seemed to forget about you and blow over the top of you in its search for somewhere to hurl itself. I led the donkey so that its large body on short legs might partially shelter my mother. When it stood in the right spot, my mother blinked her left eye rapidly, and immediately little Put came to undo the cloak she was wrapped in. I knew it was time to rub her with oil. It was already much later than usual. She had to eat, and she should sit up for a while, held in my arms. I wanted to gather some of the bits of wood I saw lying about, boil water, and set up the tent so we could sit and watch the activity in the valley from there. Everyone was tired after the long trek, and now that we had arrived, a long rest seemed a proper reward. But my father kept striding up and down impatiently. Some marum grass cutters were climbing up, sickles in their hands and baskets on their backs. When they had passed and the way was clear, he stood by the edge of the steep path. It was wide, much wider than the goat trails we had been following earlier, and